Two chemists who sparked a worldwide controversy just over a year ago want an end to what they call the scientific polarization that has stifled cold fusion research.
The comments came during the first day of a three-day international conference in Salt Lake. Our science specialist, Ed Yates, was there.
While still in the minority, tenacious scientists fascinated with the controversial cold fusion experiments gathered at the University Park Hotel. Dr. Stanley Pons presented new data confirming the Utah heat measurements, but he admits the work for the past year has simply covered old ground.
We feel this controversy has put us back at least a year, in developing a tighter theoretical base and things that so far we've proved nothing additional in the whole year, except we've reconfirmed over and over what we've done.
But those reaffirmations of heat, not only from Utah but other groups, is keeping the controversial science alive. Scientists from India reaffirmed their work. Italian physicists joined others in proposing a theory that may explain a clean pathway for fusion never observed before in a solid, but one that could account for the excess heat. And while not presenting a paper, scientist Hideo Ikegami reaffirmed Japan has 40 groups with 150 researchers working on cold fusion. He was obviously pleased with today's session.
Cold fusion activity is almost going to die in this country. But I'm very surprised and also impressed very much, and also at the same time encouraged very much. Knowing those all very positive results coming out today.
But the conference is not without critics, especially outspoken skeptics like John Huizenga, who say no one yet has come forward with substantial byproducts of fusion that mark a pathway for either a known or unknown nuclear reaction.
Unless the people producing lots of heat start giving us some evidence for particles, I think they're going to have to look someplace else to explain the excess heat.
It's doubtful this three-day conference will alter what Martin Fleischmann calls the polarization that now separates the believers from the non-believers, but at least he would like to see the split narrow so that the real mystery of cold fusion can at least play itself through once and for all.
We want to have you back at 6:30, Ed, to tell us about the unusual politics that were being played with the press at that news conference today. We'll get back and talk more about that.
As we told you at 6, there is an international cold fusion conference underway in Salt Lake City.
Science specialist Ed Yates attended that conference, and he joins us now with more on what went on today. Was this made up primarily of cold fusion believers?
Well, Bruce, let me say that the presenters who are actually presenting papers, of course, are believers. These involve members of the so-called Cold Fusion Club that have been dabbling in this work for a long time. But the audience was full of critics, too. So it was countered by critics in the audience who would ask questions of the presenters.
We're saying it's an international cold fusion conference. Are there a lot of reporters here?
A lot of reporters. I think 100 reporters registered for this conference. I don't know that all 100 came, but there are a lot here, and they're from all over the country and the world.
And involving reporters, there was an event that had not so much to do with science as with reporting and politics. Why don't you fill us in on that?
Well, you might see some video right here. This was an event that happened during the news conference with Drs. Pons and Fleischmann when Rod Decker from Channel 2 was excluded from the news conference. And here he's talking briefly to Martin Fleischmann after the news conference is over. But Martin Fleischmann and Stanley Pons basically decided that they would not include some members of the media, basically the New York Times, some other national press, and Rod Decker from Channel 2.
These are representatives of the press who had shown up, and they just said, no, you can't come in?
Well, let me explain the difficulty here, Bruce. Certainly, Drs. Pons and Fleischmann have any prerogative to talk to whichever reporters they want to talk to.
But if you hold a news conference,
it's highly unusual. And that's the difficulty they ran in today, is that they changed the context of this conversation with reporters to a news conference. And when they did that, of course, that sets up ethical parameters in our own field in which, if it's a news conference, it's public and everyone is included. And that's the difficulty they ran into.
Was there any sentiment on the part of the reporters inside to stand in solidarity with their compatriots and say, we all play the game or none of us play the game?
I think that the reporters, including myself, were uncomfortable with the situation that developed when it developed into a news conference. I actually had talked to Drs. Pons and Fleischmann prior to the news conference and said that this was a very uncomfortable situation, and I think they ought to include Channel 2. Now, if they'd included all of the local media, that's one thing. That may be okay, and you exclude the national media. I mean, there are some events that we go to. You can be credentialed for news. That's right, exactly. But what happened here is that all of the local media was invited except
for Channel 2.
What did Rod Decker say about this? He has a reputation in town.
I don't know what Rod Decker specifically said to Pons and Fleischman, Doctors Pons and Fleischman, about the situation. I know that after the news conference back at the hotel, Rod Decker made an effort to contact Stanley Pons and try to get some kind of resolution to why Channel 2 was excluded from the news conference.
Interesting. Thanks very much, Ed.
An umbrella of skepticism covers them as scientists from around the world gather in Salt Lake to talk about their latest findings on cold fusion. Our science specialist Ed Yates was there today.
It was a first for many of these scientists as they toured the University of Utah's Cold Fusion Institute late this afternoon, but few of them now are latecomers dabbling in these controversial experiments. Scientist Hideo Ikegami confirmed Japan has 40 groups with 150 researchers currently working on cold fusion, and all backed with a budget into the millions of dollars. Dr. Ikegami says he would like to collaborate with Pons and Fleischman. Scientists in India also claim excess heat and tritium from their own experiments. But the conference is not without its critics, especially outspoken skeptics like John Huizenga, who question what he calls the lingering for both known or unknown high-level nuclear reaction.
Unless the people producing lots of heat start giving us some evidence for particles, I think they're going to have to look someplace else to explain the excess heat.
But a physicist from Italy has joined others now in proposing theories that may explain a pathway for fusion never observed before in a solid, but one that could account for the excess heat. Dr. Giuliano Preparata today chastised his colleagues for what he calls a closed mentality for new ideas.
But if you can just stay there, rigid. You don't want to talk. People don't want even to, my colleagues, some of them don't even discuss this thing. Then, I mean, there's no way of really going ahead and becoming better.
Dr. Martin Fleischman called for an end to the polarization between the sciences. He's asking for international cooperation to help unravel the mystery that is still very much a part of this science. Ed Yates, Eyewitness News, Salt Lake City.
The first annual conference on cold fusion is underway at the University of Utah. Scientists favorable to the idea are here from around the world, but only a few of those critical of cold fusion are attending. Coincidentally, a University of Utah article derogatory of cold fusion appears today in the national science magazine, Nature. KUTV's Rod Decker joins us live from the conference. Rod?
Doug, the conference is going on at the University Park Hotel, and they are still in session, and they aren't allowing cameras in their session. Down here by the physics building, I'm with Dr. Ed Wren, who's a radiobiologist, and Dr. Michael Solomon, who's a physicist. And they were in Dr. Pond's lab last summer, and they looked for radiation. And the theory says that if you've got fusion, you've got to have radiation. Dr. Solomon, what'd you find?
Well, it's the same thing that we reported a number of months ago, and our conclusions haven't changed. During the time that we were in Dr. Pons' laboratory, we saw no evidence for any known fusion reactions occurring in his lab. And it doesn't matter where his cells were located in his lab. If his cells had been at the opposite end of the room from our detector, we would have seen normal fusion processes had they produced an observable amount of excess heat.
Dr. Wren, what do you conclude from this?
Well, we concluded that during the period we were there, we did not see any radiations resulting from conventional known fusion reactions.
How long were you there? You say during the period?
Well, we were there, we reported on 5 weeks, but we were there closer to 7. We did see one interesting event. Someone brought a calibration source into the laboratory. We can tell you that it was cesium-137, and we can tell you that within 30 minutes of when they brought it into the lab. And they also did that with the sodium-22 source.
Okay, so people sneaked stuff in on you. You didn't know about it, and you thought, oh my goodness, we've got it, huh?
We looked at it really carefully, and then we were really interested to see the special signature of those isotopes.
Assume you're right, there was no radiation in the lab. What is the conclusion then that a physicist would draw with respect to traditional fusion?
Well, of course, the question has to be asked, how much excess heat was produced during that period? And that's information that we really haven't had access to. There was one episode of thermal release during the time that we were there, and we have no observable fusion measure. There are no observable observation signatures of that, of a known fusion process occurring during that event.
Thank you very much. So you hear, these two scientists were in Dr. Pond's lab several weeks, They saw no radiation, and that would lead to the conclusion that it was unlikely that fusion was going on in the lab during that period. Back to the studio.